When Jasmine Crockett, a fearless black attorney, demanded justice for thousands of exploited workers, her words struck so deeply that the courtroom descended into chaos. Judge Coney Barrett ruthlessly had her thrown out. The cameras kept rolling as she was silenced, but within hours the footage went viral, sparking mass protests, legal investigations, and a reckoning across every corner of America. What did she say that shook the foundations of the justice system? And why did the nation see her removal as a symbol of everything that's broken? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. They said she wouldn't dare, that no black woman in her right mind would walk through the marbled gates of the Supreme Court and challenge the foundations of a billion-dollar tech empire. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't most women. Dubbed the Justice Warrior by both her allies and detractors, she strode into the nation's highest court like a storm wrapped in silk. Heels sharp, stare sharper. Her suit was tailored like armor, her legal briefs clutched like weapons forged in the fires of injustice. Behind her was a class-action lawsuit representing over 1,200 underpaid and overworked tech workers, many of them immigrants, single mothers, and veterans left behind in the race for profit. And ahead of her, Justice Coney Barrett, a symbol of stoic conservatism, presiding with icy calm. The courtroom buzzed with electricity. Murmurs rippled across the benches, journalists poised like vultures, pens trembling with anticipation. Camera flashes caught the tension in the air. This was not just a hearing, it was a showdown. And as Jasmine's eyes locked with Barrett's across the chamber, the message was clear. This wasn't going to be a polite debate, it was going to be war. From the moment she opened her briefcase, you could feel the temperature drop. Jasmine began with a statement that didn't just echo, it detonated. When justice forgets the working class, it ceases to be justice, she declared, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade through silk. The defense team smirked, expecting her to crumble under formality, but she was surgical, dismantling their arguments like an assassin taking out targets. These companies automate dignity, they program poverty, and your silence, your delay in action, that's complicity, she snapped, eyes scanning the bench, daring anyone to interrupt her. Barrett raised an eyebrow. First contact. Tension slithered through the room like smoke under a closed door. A clerk shifted uncomfortably. A court officer moved his hand toward his radio. This was not how Supreme Court hearings were supposed to feel. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't here to play by the script. She was here to burn it. And just when it seemed Jasmine had seized control of the room, when the tide of energy was hers to command, and every word she spoke carved deeper into the system, she came to challenge. Justice Coney Barrett leaned forward, slowly, deliberately. The shift in her posture was slight but unmistakable, like the calm that settles before a blade is drawn. Her fingers intertwined, resting just above the polished mahogany bench, and her voice emerged, low, measured, and as cold as a courtroom in winter. "Ms. Crockett," she began, her tone void of emotion, but laced with intent. "Are you here to practice law, or to build a legacy?" The words struck without force, but with precision. "Are you seeking justice for your clients, or the spotlight for yourself?" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Each syllable was delivered with the detachment of a seasoned judge who's seen ambition in many forms, and never trusted any of them. The air in the chamber shifted. A few pens paused mid-note. Jasmine didn't speak yet. Barrett continued, eyes locked, her voice unwavering. "You speak with fire, Ms. Crockett, but fire can illuminate, or it can burn. I'm asking whether you understand the difference." There was no accusation in her tone, and yet the implication was razor-sharp, that Jasmine, a black woman standing tall in a room built for power, might be using this court as a stage. The silence after Barrett's question was dense, unyielding, like the air before a coming storm. All eyes locked on Jasmine Crockett, waiting to see whether she would falter, whether the accusation would sink into her skin like so many others had been designed to. But she didn't break. She didn't even blink. She inhaled once, slowly, grounding herself not in defiance but in truth. Then she raised her head, chin steady, eyes focused, voice clear and unmistakably calm. My name, she began, wasn't built on privilege. It was built on struggle and justice. Her words landed with force, not loud but heavy. I didn't grow up with connections. I had to fight for every inch, break down every door, and still be ready to face another wall behind it. Her voice stayed even, but the meaning was sharp. No one handed me power. I stand here because people who've been ignored for too long trusted me to speak for them. She paused, letting the weight of that truth settle. I didn't come here for fame, she said, eyes fixed on Barrett. I came here to speak because too many people who look like me never get the chance to. And when they do, they're told they're too loud. Her tone grew firm, controlled. I raise my voice because justice usually turns its head when the truth is uncomfortable. She took a breath, her gaze unwavering. If that makes me a threat, fine. But don't call it ego. I earned this voice, and I won't be quiet to make anyone else feel safe. Barrett didn't respond right away, but when she did, her voice dropped into something colder, quieter, and far more dangerous. The shift in tone was subtle, but it changed everything. Then let's examine who you say you're fighting for, she said, reaching for a thick case file resting beside her. Her fingers moved with the calm precision of someone peeling back a curtain, not to reveal, but to expose. She flipped the folder open and held up a stack of neatly highlighted documents. We've received multiple complaints regarding your conduct in previous proceedings, not just from corporate defense teams, but from fellow members of the bar. Her gaze was steady, almost surgical. They describe your tactics as aggressive, your language inflammatory, your courtroom presence unprofessional. Her words were crisp, clipped, intended not to provoke, but to slice. She didn't stop. You claim to stand for the rights of laborers, for the underpaid and unheard, but some argue you've turned advocacy into spectacle. The words landed like controlled detonations, each one more precise than the last. You're not just challenging one of the largest tech corporations in the country, Ms. Crockett. You've refused settlement offers, dismissed arbitration, and openly criticized the judicial system that you now ask to deliver justice. She paused, letting the implications sink in. Some say this isn't about justice anymore. It's about defiance, about pride. The room grew tighter, air thinned. Even the spectators who had moments ago nodded with Jasmine's fire now watched with uncertainty. Barrett's voice softened, but her stare didn't. Are you really fighting for justice, or just refusing to kneel, no matter the cost? The air was already tight, every breath in the courtroom measured, strained. But Barrett wasn't finished. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly on the bench, but her eyes had sharpened into something colder, clinical, unblinking. The silence that followed her last challenge hung like fog, but it wasn't peace. It was pressure. Then, without raising her voice or changing her expression, she delivered the question that cut deeper than anything yet. Tell me, Ms. Crockett, she said slowly, each word as precise as the edge of a blade. Are you standing here as a representative of justice, or just another political echo, dressed in legal robes? The words didn't explode. They pierced. The kind of question that didn't shout, but hollowed. That didn't accuse, but destabilized. Around the room, backs stiffened, necks turned. It was no longer about the case. Barrett had shifted the spotlight off facts and onto identity, onto motive. Is your presence in this courtroom a pursuit of fairness? She continued, voice never rising. Or a performance crafted for headlines and applause? Her expression didn't change. She didn't need to raise her tone to raise the stakes. Are you here to defend the voiceless, or to amplify your own? The tension was unbearable, the kind that silences 100 people without a single order. Barrett's questions weren't wild. They were razor-focused, and they carried with them a message rarely spoken out loud but always present. You don't belong here unless you're playing by our rules. The weight of Barrett's question still hung in the air, heavy and deliberate, meant to press Jasmine into a corner she had stepped out of long ago. But Jasmine didn't shift. She didn't fold. She stood tall, hands calmly clasped in front of her, eyes locked on the bench with a stare that didn't challenge protocol, but refused to surrender to it. Her voice, when it came, didn't rise. But it deepened. It carried with it the weariness of battles fought in silence, and the strength of voices she carried inside her. "I am the voice of those who don't get courtrooms," she said slowly and clearly, her words slicing through the silence like a steady blade. "The people who never make it past a closed door, whose names never make it onto a docket, whose stories are cut off at the lobby, if they're ever heard at all." Her tone didn't seek sympathy. It stood on truth. "I speak for them because no one else will. And when I walk into rooms like this, I carry their names on my back." She let that sit, her eyes never wavering. "So if that makes me loud, or inconvenient, or too bold for comfort, good. That means I'm doing my job." Then without pause, without blinking, she dropped the line that would echo through the walls. "Power doesn't fear the law," she said, calm as stone. "It fears justice when it shows up on time." A hush fell over the chamber, thick and still. It wasn't applause that followed, or noise. It was something far more unsettling for power. Recognition. The silence that followed Jasmine's words was electric, but it wasn't admiration that filled the air. It was tension, thick and volatile, like a fuse burning too close to the powder. Justice Barrett had remained composed throughout the hearing, her tone steady, her demeanor professional. But now that composure was cracking, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for anyone paying attention to feel the cold edge creeping into her voice, the stiffness in her shoulders, the subtle but unmistakable signs of control being tested. She shifted in her seat, the movement sharp, deliberate. Her eyes locked onto Jasmine, no longer with curiosity or skepticism, but with rising irritation. "Ms. Crockett," she said, each syllable clipped like a reprimand etched in stone, "this court operates under strict procedure. You are beginning to step far beyond it." Her fingers pressed together on the bench, knuckles tightening just enough to turn pale. "Your commentary, while passionate, is not a substitute for legal argument. This is not the floor of a political assembly. It is a court of law." Her voice didn't rise, but it darkened, like a storm cloud rolling in without thunder. "If you continue down this path, you risk undermining the very case you claim to defend." The room tensed. Even those in the gallery who had cheered silently for Jasmine a moment ago now sat rigid, as if afraid to breathe too loudly. Barrett's words weren't about rules. They were about control, about reigning in a voice that refused to shrink. And in that moment, it was clear. This wasn't just about maintaining order. It was about putting Jasmine back in a place where her power could be contained. Barrett's warning still echoed through the chamber, crisp and final, but Jasmine Crockett stood motionless, not in defiance, but in quiet resolve that radiated louder than any objection. She didn't blink. She didn't break eye contact. What came next wasn't shouted, wasn't dramatized. It was delivered with the precision of someone who had held her tongue long enough. "This court," she said, voice calm but laced with heat, "listens more closely to the powerful than it ever does to the truth." Her words didn't just challenge authority, they exposed it. A quiet gasp rippled through the back rows, but Jasmine pressed on, unfazed. "I've seen how fast this room tightens when someone like me speaks too clearly," she continued, eyes locked on the bench. "But when the voices backed by billions twist the law, this chamber calls it strategy." Her hands remained still at her sides, but her presence surged forward like a rising tide. "You say I'm out of order," she added, her tone colder now. "But what do you call it when truth is treated like noise and money like wisdom?" The gallery had fallen silent, not out of respect, but because they knew they were witnessing something volatile and true. If being passionate makes me disruptive, then maybe the system was never built for justice. Only for control, Jasmine said. And if control means I have to shrink my voice to fit inside someone else's comfort, then let me be clear, I won't. Every syllable hit with the force of someone who'd learned too well what happens when you ask nicely and wait quietly. And as she finished, the stillness in the room was no longer tension. It was reckoning. The courtroom had turned into a pressure chamber, silent, heavy, volatile. Jasmine Crockett's last words were still hanging in the air, not fading, but expanding, pressing against every marble wall, every pane of glass, every brittle thread of tradition that framed the room. Her voice hadn't trembled. Her tone hadn't cracked. She had said what needed to be said, and she had said it with the precision of someone who knew exactly what it would cost. Justice Amy Coney. Barrett didn't speak immediately. She stared, her expression unreadable, somewhere between disbelief and cold resolve. Then her jaw set, sharp as stone. Her voice, when it came, was louder than before, but not by much. She didn't need volume. The tension did the rest. "That's enough," Barrett said, her tone clipped and final, each syllable striking like the drop of a steel gate. "This is no longer a hearing. This is a disruption. You are dismissed, Miss Crockett." Her words didn't ring. They landed like verdicts, like orders that didn't expect delay. The room responded before the mind could catch up. A collective intake of breath swept the gallery. Some gasped. Others froze mid-note, pens hovering in the air. Camera shutters started clicking, sporadically at first, then in rhythm, capturing a moment no one had seen coming, but somehow everyone felt building. The entire courtroom had become an arena, and Jasmine Crockett was no longer just an attorney. She was a symbol on trial in real time. Two court officers moved instantly, stepping forward from opposite sides of the room, hands low but purposeful, radio earpieces catching the light. They weren't rushing, but they weren't hesitating either. The path from witness bench to exit had suddenly turned into something else entirely. A stage, a line in the sand. But Jasmine didn't move. She didn't budge. She didn't lower her eyes or her voice. Instead, she straightened her spine. She turned not to walk out, but to face the bench once more. Her voice rose, not in volume, but in power, in finality. "You want me out because I told the truth," she said calmly, clearly. "Because I named what no one else in this room dares to say out loud." Her tone was firm, unyielding. "But don't pretend this is about decorum. This is about discomfort. Yours." Barrett's gaze didn't waver, but the muscles in her jaw tightened again. She didn't repeat herself. She didn't need to. Her silence screamed of finality. The court officers took another step forward, closing the distance. The audience held its collective breath. Somewhere in the back, someone's phone buzzed, then was quickly silenced. The room was still, but the energy was boiling, like steam locked inside steel. Jasmine didn't wait to be touched. She lifted one hand slowly, not in surrender, but in command. "I came here to speak for those who aren't allowed in this room," she said, each word deliberate, cutting. "I came here because truth doesn't walk in politely and wait its turn. Truth interrupts." A murmur stirred in the gallery, low but rising. Some nodded. Others sat stone-faced, unsure if they were witnessing a career imploding or a revolution igniting. "I have followed the rules," Jasmine continued, voice tightening with every word. "But when the rules only protect those who already have power, following them becomes complicity, and I refuse to be complicit." One of the officers reached out gently, hand hovering near her elbow. She didn't pull away violently, but she didn't move either. Her body held the tension of a loaded spring, her eyes still locked on the bench. "You can remove me," she said, her voice now lower, but somehow even more commanding. "You can escort me out of this room. You can call it order. You can call it protocol. But you cannot call it justice." The officer paused, just long enough to hesitate, just long enough to remember he was touching not just a woman, but a moment that would echo far beyond this chamber. Barrett's voice sliced in again, tone like a blade. "Bailiff," she said curtly. One word, no emotion, no explanation. It was happening, but Jasmine wasn't finished. "I won't walk out of here quietly because too many before me were forced to," she said, her voice cracking, not from fear but from the strain of truth meeting resistance. "Too many had to smile while being erased. I won't be one of them." The officers stepped closer. One touched her shoulder, not roughly but firmly. Jasmine turned slightly, then looked over the gallery. Her eyes scanned the faces, some sympathetic, some stunned, a few deliberately looking away. But no one was unmoved. Even the silence felt changed. "This room," she said, raising her voice just enough to rise over the moment, "was built to silence people like me when we get too loud. But the truth doesn't ask for permission. It breaks in. And then finally she stepped forward, not pushed, not dragged. She walked on her own terms. But before she reached the door, she turned one last time to face the bench. "History won't remember your rule," she said, her tone soft but absolute. "It will remember who had the courage to break them, for the right reason." Then she was gone, and the room, once loud with power, now felt hollow with its absence. The door had barely closed behind Jasmine Crockett when the real explosion began. Not in the courtroom, but out in the world, where the eyes of millions had been watching, waiting, and now finally reacting. The first video surfaced less than 15 minutes after her removal. It was grainy, shaky, clearly filmed on a phone hidden low between the benches, but it captured everything. Jasmine standing tall, her voice unwavering, eyes locked on the bench as two court officers moved toward her. Her words rang out over the murmuring courtroom like a lightning bolt through glass. "You can remove my body, but not the truth I put in this room." That sentence, just 11 words, ignited something that no legal brief or televised hearing ever could. Within an hour, the clip had amassed hundreds of thousands of views across X, TikTok, YouTube, and Facebook. But more than that, it had struck a nerve. People weren't just watching, they were feeling, and the feeling was fury. The internet lit up with a kind of collective clarity. This wasn't just about courtroom protocol. This was about a system that punished truth the moment it became uncomfortable. The hashtag # Justice for Jasmine began circulating within minutes, and it didn't rise slowly. It surged. Factory workers, public school teachers, nurses, custodians, delivery drivers, people far from the polished corridors of justice, were the first to post. They shared the video with short, sharp captions. "She spoke for us. This is what happens when truth walks into power's house." They dragged her out because they couldn't drag her words away. The working class, especially, responded with lightning speed. Jasmine's voice didn't sound like politics to them. It sounded like lived experience of being talked over, shut down, told to wait, told to comply, told they were too angry, too loud, too unprofessional. She had said it in real time, in the most sacred legal space in the country, and they watched her get punished for it. The symbolism was too strong, too clear. She was speaking for them, and she had paid the price. By nightfall, hashtag Justice for Jasmine was not just trending. It was a banner, a digital battle cry. Artists began sketching stills from the video. Jasmine's hand raised, her body turned defiantly toward the bench. Poets recorded spoken word responses in parking lots, living rooms, classrooms. Protest musicians turned her quotes into hooks and verses, set to the rhythms of resistance. The video was remixed, dissected, captioned in multiple languages. But it wasn't just content, it was connection. The support spilled far beyond social media. Statements poured in from progressive legal groups, civil rights attorneys, and human rights watchdogs. The American Civil Liberties Union issued a formal response within hours. Silencing a voice in a courtroom, especially when speaking on behalf of the voiceless, is a serious threat to free expression, equity, and public trust in the judiciary. Human Rights Watch added, "What we witnessed today was not simply a disruption. It was a public example of how justice is often shaped to serve order over truth." Even prominent figures in the legal community, many of whom had once been cautious about Jasmine's assertive courtroom style, began to rally to her side. "We don't have to agree with her tone," one Harvard law professor tweeted, "but we must defend her right to speak without being erased from the room." Independent lawyers posted solidarity videos, many of them sitting in their own offices, holding copies of the U.S. Constitution, reciting the First Amendment word for word. Across the country, the ripple effects grew louder. At a factory in Indiana, workers paused a shift to watch the full hearing replayed on breakroom monitors. At a community college in Houston, a group of law students staged a silent protest, taping black cloth over their mouths with number Justice for Jasmine written in white marker. Late-night news anchors, usually guarded, broke from their scripts to speak directly to the camera. What happened today should concern every American, no matter your politics. If a woman can be removed from the courtroom for speaking the truth, what does that mean for the rest of us? And still, Jasmine remained silent. She hadn't posted, hadn't tweeted, hadn't spoken to reporters waiting outside her apartment. But her silence didn't weaken the movement. It made it stronger. People filled the void with their own voices, their own stories, their own truths. "She's carrying us," one woman wrote in a viral post. "Now it's our turn to carry her." The momentum didn't fade overnight. It built, because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just stood up for a case. She had exposed something that was never meant to be seen so clearly, that sometimes in America's highest courts, truth is only welcome when it stays quiet. And Jasmine? Jasmine made sure it couldn't. The wave of public outrage had reached a roar, but what came next gave it shape, weight, and legitimacy. It was no longer just a story of a woman being silenced. It was now a direct challenge to the very idea of who gets to speak inside America's most powerful rooms. Just 3 days after Jasmine Crockett's removal from the courtroom, an open letter began to circulate, signed not by activists, not by students, but by a formidable group of elder statesmen from within the legal system itself. Retired federal judges, former appellate justices, lifelong prosecutors, legal scholars with careers older than the internet, men and women with silver hair, decades of rulings behind them, and gravitas that couldn't be dismissed. Many of them had spent their lives defending the same institutions Jasmine had stood inside, and yet they wrote with clarity and conviction. The courtroom is not a sanctuary for silence. It is a forum for truth, and no truth should be punished for speaking plainly. The statement didn't ask for nuance. It demanded accountability. It stated in unflinching terms that what happened to Jasmine Crockett was not just an overreach. It was an erosion, a betrayal of the very principles they had sworn to uphold. The response was immediate and thunderous. News outlets across the country aired segments titled, "When the System Calls Itself Out." Legal analysts, some of whom had criticized Jasmine for her tactics in the past, now admitted they had missed the point. "It's not about tone," one commentator said on live TV. "It's about who gets to speak without fear of being removed." The open letter went viral, racking up millions of views, becoming a centerpiece in a movement that was growing more focused by the hour. Fuel was added to the fire when a petition calling for a formal review of Justice Barrett's decision crossed 500,000 signatures in just under 72 hours. But these weren't just digital signatures. They came with names, professions, and personal stories. A retired steelworker from Pennsylvania wrote, "I never thought much about courts until I saw that woman get dragged out for saying what's right." A single mother in Mississippi wrote, "She said what my daughter's teachers are afraid to say out loud." The message was clear. Jasmine hadn't disrupted order. She had disrupted silence. And the people knew the difference. Capitol Hill couldn't ignore it. What began as a courtroom incident was now a national flashpoint, and senators, some cautious, others galvanized, stepped into the spotlight. A coalition of lawmakers held a press briefing on the Capitol steps, flanked by constitutional experts and legal ethics professors. They called for something rarely attempted in recent memory: public congressional hearings on judicial conduct and First Amendment rights inside federal courtrooms. Their language was sharp, pointed. If the courts no longer tolerate speech that challenges power, then the law itself is compromised, one senator declared. "We are not here to shield discomfort. We are here to protect the Constitution, even inside the walls of the Supreme Court." The press swarmed them. Journalists asked if this was about Jasmine's case alone. The response came swift. "This isn't about one woman. This is about a nation's right to question authority without being removed from the room." The clip aired live across every major network. The story, once viewed through the lens of courtroom drama, was now a civic reckoning. Jasmine Crockett had gone from being a voice for the voiceless to becoming a mirror, reflecting a deeper, older truth back at a country long trained to ignore it. And the institutions at last were being forced to answer. As pressure mounted from every corner of the nation, streets, screens, and Senate floors, the walls of the highest court in the land could no longer hold. In a rare and stunning move, the Supreme Court issued an official notice. The case Jasmine Crockett had been ejected from would be reopened. But this time, it would be heard under a new panel of justices, an independent review bench assembled specifically to restore public trust in the process. The announcement dropped like a seismic wave through the legal world. Reporters raced to confirm it wasn't a rumor. Court clerks, tight-lipped for days, began scrambling under the weight of incoming inquiries. The statement was brief, but every word hit like a sledgehammer. Due to extraordinary public interest and questions raised regarding the procedural handling of the previous hearing, the matter will be reassigned to a neutral panel for full reconsideration. For Jasmine, it was more than a second chance. It was validation, not just of her argument, but of her right to make it. The courtroom that had tried to erase her voice was now, under intense national scrutiny, forced to make room for it again. Legal experts called it unprecedented. Civil rights historians called it historic. And for the millions watching, holding their breath across kitchen tables and factory floors, it felt like something deeper, like justice fighting its way back into the room it was once thrown out of. The court's decision to reopen the case under a new panel was a crack in the fortress. But what followed was the moment that shook its foundations. For the second time, Jasmine Crockett walked toward the Supreme Court. But this time, she wasn't walking in alone. The steps outside were lined with people. Hundreds at first, then thousands. Some carried signs. Some carried silence. All carried purpose. The air was thick with anticipation, but this was no longer a battle between a lone voice in a towering institution. This was the return of a silenced advocate, walking back into the room that once tried to erase her, this time on her terms. Inside, the gallery was full before the doors even opened. Law students, civil rights leaders, labor advocates, and ordinary citizens who had never set foot in a federal courtroom now waited, eyes forward, for the woman who had become their voice. Even her peers, fellow attorneys, clerks, and legal aides, stood as she entered, not out of protocol, but respect. The silence that greeted her was not empty. It was reverent. And as Jasmine moved toward the counsel's table, the tension in the room wasn't fear. It was hope, sharpened into steel. As Jasmine Crockett took her place once more at the counsel's table, steady and silent beneath the vaulted ceiling of the highest court in the land, one presence was notably, undeniably missing. Justice Amy Coney Barrett. She was not on the bench. No formal statement explained her absence. No press release justified her withdrawal. But the message was clear, not just in her silence, but in what her absence triggered across every level of the American legal system. In the days following the reopening of the case, something unprecedented began to unfold. Barrett's removal from the new judicial panel sent shockwaves through the judiciary, not as punishment, but as precedent. The very system that had once stood untouchable was now forced to look inward. Across law schools, courtrooms, and judicial chambers, quiet conversations turned into urgent inquiries. What exactly are the limits of courtroom speech? What constitutes disruption? And what is simply dissent? These weren't abstract debates anymore. They were live questions in a country that had just watched a black female attorney get ejected from the nation's highest court for speaking the plain truth too boldly, too directly, and too unapologetically. Panels of senior judges began meeting in private review boards, tasked with examining long-standing but vaguely defined codes of courtroom decorum. The language of these rules, phrases like orderly conduct, professional tone, appropriate demeanor, was now being scrutinized under a new light. For years, these words had operated as invisible walls, used selectively to silence or constrain, often without recourse. Now, those same phrases were being dissected and debated in emergency judicial ethics committees, with one central question at their core. Had the system used the rules not to protect justice, but to shield power from accountability? The ripple effect didn't stop there. The American Bar Association, responding to mounting pressure from both its own members and the public, convened a national summit on courtroom rights and attorney speech. It was the first of its kind in over 30 years. Drafts of new guidelines emerged quickly, clearer protections for legal advocates to speak forcefully in the face of judicial authority, so long as they remained within legal bounds. The proposals included new language meant to prevent retaliation against lawyers who challenged the bench, especially in cases involving civil rights, labor, or public interest litigation. Among many in the legal community, these changes began to be referred to informally, but widely as the Crockett precedent. Though unofficial, the nickname stuck, not because of politics, but because of clarity. Jasmine's moment in that courtroom had revealed a systemic flaw with stunning simplicity. When power feels threatened, it can call passion disorder and label truth as misconduct. That realization was no longer theoretical. It had been broadcast live to millions, and now it was being carved into the legal fabric of the nation. Barrett herself offered no comment, no interview, no written statement. But within legal circles, her silence carried weight. Not defeat, not admission, but consequence. The court had moved on without her, but the system could not forget what her gavel had triggered. A single order to remove one woman had forced the most revered legal institution in America to revisit the very lines that define justice, silence, and speech. And from those lines, rewritten now in sharper ink, a new standard was rising. The courtroom reforms rippled through the legal world like a seismic shift, but the heart of the matter still waited at the center. The case itself, the people Jasmine Crockett had risked everything to defend. And when the ruling finally came down, it did not whisper, it roared. In a decision that would make headlines across every major news outlet, the new panel of justices ruled unanimously in Jasmine's favor. The verdict was as sweeping as it was direct. The tech conglomerate that had long evaded accountability was found liable for systemic violations of worker safety, wage suppression, and retaliation against whistleblowers. The court's findings were scathing, the language uncharacteristically human. One line from the majority opinion would be quoted again and again. A voice raised in defense of dignity must never be treated as a threat to order. But the ruling didn't stop at moral vindication. It had teeth. The court ordered immediate financial restitution to over 1,200 employees affected by the company's practices, totaling hundreds of millions in back pay, damages, and penalties. The impact was instant. For many of those workers, justice had never felt like an option. Now it arrived with the weight of law behind it, and the woman who refused to be silenced standing at its helm. But Jasmine's victory extended far beyond the walls of any courtroom. She hadn't just won a case. She had shifted public consciousness. Her story of defiance, of removal, of return had become a rallying cry not just for the legal community, but for the working class, for the unheard, for anyone who had ever been told they were too loud, too angry, too much. On factory floors, in teacher lounges, in late-night shift rotations, and break room corners, people talked about her as if they had known her their whole lives. Not because she was perfect, but because she was right. She had spoken with the kind of raw honesty that doesn't come from legal training, but from living close to the edge of power, where justice is often a rumor, not a right. Legally, her win forced a chain reaction. State labor departments across the country began re-examining safety protocols and employer compliance with renewed scrutiny. Within weeks, new federal legislation was introduced under bipartisan sponsorship, drafted with direct input from labor attorneys, union leaders, and yes, Jasmine herself. The bill proposed stricter nationwide standards for workplace safety, mandatory third-party audits for tech and manufacturing companies, and, perhaps most significantly, legal protections for employees who spoke up about abuse or exploitation. In one press conference, a senator who had once remained neutral during the initial firestorm said simply, "We have her to thank for this." In corporate boardrooms, the temperature shifted. Quietly, CEOs who had once mocked whistleblower protections now pushed internal compliance reform. PR departments were ordered to review past labor complaints. HR training modules were rewritten. Investors began asking new questions about ethics, about worker treatment, about the reputational risks of silence. What Jasmine had triggered wasn't just a legal precedent. It was cultural accountability, forced upon the powerful, not by polite suggestion, but by the undeniable echo of justice finally being heard. For Jasmine, the victory was surreal, but not soft. She didn't celebrate with champagne or victory tours. She returned to her office late that night, where the lights were still on, her desk still scattered with notes scribbled during the chaos. The same chair she sat in when the world tried to end her credibility now waited for her return. And when she sat in it, surrounded by stacks of case files, the weight of what she had done didn't feel triumphant. It felt necessary. Because this was never just about one courtroom or one ruling. It was about all the rooms she would never be allowed into, all the voices she still had to carry, all the truths still waiting to be said. Outside the courthouse, hundreds gathered to hear the decision read aloud. They stood shoulder to shoulder, union organizers, mothers with children, retired teachers, former workers who had been part of the suit. When Jasmine stepped outside, they erupted, not in cheers, but in applause that carried something deeper: recognition. She didn't speak for long. She didn't need to. Her words were simple, measured, spoken with the same clarity that had once gotten her thrown out. "This is not my victory. It's yours. I just refuse to walk away." Across the nation, celebrations unfolded, not with banners and parades, but with quiet moments of relief. In Alabama, a welder watched the news from a diner booth and wept into his coffee. In Detroit, a school bus driver handed a student a folded newspaper with Jasmine's picture on the front and whispered, "Remember her name." In Queens, a night shift nurse sat on the steps outside the hospital and texted her union rep, "It's our turn next." But the deepest change came where it was needed most: the law. Courts began applying the Crockett ruling as a new benchmark for labor-related cases. Judges referenced her arguments in footnotes and oral statements. Legal textbooks updated entire chapters to include what had happened in that courtroom and what followed. Law students, especially young women, especially women of color, began citing Jasmine's case not just in essays, but in dreams. And slowly, painfully, the doors that had been closed for so long began to creak open. Not because the system was generous, but because someone had kicked hard enough for the hinges to loosen. Yet amid the rising reforms and overdue justice, one truth remained steady. Jasmine Crockett had not been invited into history. She had forced her way in. And in doing so, she had rewritten what it meant to win. Not with politeness or patience, but with conviction that refused to shrink. Her legal victory, while stunning, was not her greatest achievement. Her greatest achievement was surviving the system that tried to contain her and making it answer for what it had done. Not just to her, but to everyone like her who had been told their voice was too disruptive, too dangerous, too loud. Jasmine never asked to become a symbol. She asked to be heard. And in a country where truth is often edited for comfort, her full-volume refusal to stay silent became a defining moment. One that would ripple through courtrooms, legislation, and collective memory for years to come. And though the case had closed and the ink had dried, one thing remained undeniably clear. The woman they tried to silence had become the sound of justice, and no ruling, no bench, no gavel would ever drown her out again. Even after the gavel fell and justice was delivered, Jasmine Crockett knew her work wasn't done. Victories inside courtrooms were powerful, but the real war, she understood, was still being waged in factories, hospitals, warehouses, and offices where voices remained silenced and courage was still punished. And so from the ashes of her battle, she built something new. She launched a legal defense fund, not for herself, but for the countless workers across the country who didn't have the platform, the spotlight, or the legal firepower she had earned the hard way. But this wasn't just any fund. She named it after the woman who had taught her that justice begins in the small moments, in the quiet defiance of everyday people who refuse to look away. It was called the Gloria Crockett Foundation, in honor of her mother, a former nurse who had once been fired for standing up for her fellow nurses during a hospital staffing crisis. Gloria hadn't had a lawyer. She hadn't had media attention. She'd had only her voice, and the cost of using it had been her livelihood. That injustice had never left Jasmine. It had shaped her. Now, through the foundation, Jasmine made sure no one else had to fight alone. The fund offered pro bono legal support for low-wage workers facing wrongful termination, discrimination, retaliation, or unsafe working conditions. But it was more than that. It was a fire line of resistance built into the legal system. The foundation partnered with law schools, grassroots labor movements, and community organizers to create rapid response legal teams that could step in when justice was being denied in real time. A hotline was established. A database of volunteer attorneys was mobilized. Within weeks of its launch, applications poured in from across the country, from janitors in New Jersey to warehouse employees in Nevada, all seeking what Jasmine had fought to defend. Not pity, not politics, representation. But even with the infrastructure growing daily, the soul of the foundation remained deeply personal. On the walls of its first office, modest, brick-lined, tucked into a repurposed community center in South Dallas, hung a single-frame photograph, Gloria Crockett, standing in a hospital break room in the 1980s, arms crossed, eyes fierce, a nurse's ID badge still clipped to her scrub pocket. Jasmine told every new staff member the same story. "My mother was fired for doing the right thing. Now we fight so no one else gets punished for telling the truth." The tension that fueled the courtroom hadn't vanished. It had evolved. Now it lived in intake interviews with women afraid to report their bosses, in long nights spent drafting legal responses for employees told they were overreacting to racial slurs, in emergency filings for workers fired on the spot for asking about heat breaks. Jasmine faced it all, again and again. But this time, not as one voice standing alone. Now she stood at the head of a movement made real, with the law sharpened not as a shield, but as a weapon forged in fire. The foundation's impact was immediate. In its first 6 months, it helped reinstate over 300 workers, won 6 major settlements, and filed lawsuits against 4 corporations for systemic labor violations. But its greatest power wasn't in the headlines. It was in the culture shift it sparked. Employers began to think twice before issuing quiet threats. HR departments started documenting instead of ignoring. Union reps now carried copies of Gloria's law, an emerging legislative proposal inspired by the Foundation's mission, aimed at granting whistleblower protections across all industries, not just federal ones. And everywhere Jasmine went, from city halls to rural town meetings, people greeted her not with awe, but with solidarity. They didn't say, "Thank you for what you did." They said, "We needed you." Jasmine never forgot why it mattered. She remembered her mother coming home the night she was fired, still in her scrubs, hands trembling as she held her termination letter. She remembered how Gloria had sat in silence for hours, not crying, not shouting, just sitting, staring into a future that suddenly had no paycheck, no pension, no plan. Jasmine had watched that silence take root inside their home. It didn't break Gloria, but it buried something. Jasmine swore from that day forward that her voice would never be taken from her, and that one day she'd build something her mother could have turned to. And now she had. The Foundation's slogan was simple: "Because truth deserves a lawyer." It echoed across bus ads, flyers, hashtags, and courthouse rallies. But to those who walked through its doors, some trembling, some furious, all exhausted, it meant something more. It meant someone was fighting for them. It meant silence wasn't their only option. And every time Jasmine stepped into that office, past her mother's photograph and into a meeting room where case files were stacked to the ceiling, she knew the battle wasn't over. But for the first time, the battlefield was hers. The system that once tried to silence her had now become the soil for something far more powerful: a network, a movement, a legacy. And in the center of it all was the quiet, burning truth she'd always known: that justice isn't granted. It's demanded, protected, and passed on. One case, one voice, one mother, one movement at a time. From the foundation she built in her mother's name to the courtroom she helped transform, Jasmine Crockett had become more than a headline. She had become a force. But even as the cases rolled in, as reforms were drafted, and as voices across the nation grew louder in her name, there remained one stage left to face, the one she never asked for, but could no longer avoid: the eyes of the nation. It began with a single invitation: a primetime interview, national television, the kind of spot usually reserved for senators, CEOs, or celebrities. But this time, it belonged to a lawyer who'd once been physically escorted out of the Supreme Court for daring to say too much, and had since rewritten the boundaries of justice with every word they tried to silence. Jasmine didn't go for applause. She didn't sit under the lights to sell a book or boost a profile. She went for one reason only: to tell the truth in front of a country that had been watching, but still didn't fully understand what it had witnessed. She sat across from the anchor, back straight, hands calm, voice steady, not rehearsed but ready. The interview began with familiar questions: the case, the fallout, the viral moment, the aftermath. Jasmine answered them clearly, without theatrics. But it was what came next that lit a spark in every living room, classroom, newsroom, and break room across America. The anchor leaned in and asked, "Do you think it had to happen that way? That you had to be removed for things to change?" Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't look away. Her response was immediate, sharp and rooted in everything she had lived. "Sometimes," she said, her voice firm but quiet, "you have to be thrown out of the room to make the whole country listen." The words dropped like a thunderclap. There was no dramatic music, no studio pause. Just her face, unflinching, framed in silence that said more than any commentary could. Across the nation, people stopped mid-conversation, mid-scroll, mid-doubt, because they understood, deep in their bones, that she wasn't just talking about herself. She was talking about every teacher fired for pushing back, every whistleblower blacklisted, every parent shut down at a school board meeting, every voice that said, "This isn't right," and got punished for saying it out loud. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't posture. She simply explained. She spoke about the cost of being disruptive in rooms that were built to absorb conflict but never confrontation. She spoke about how justice has always required a kind of violence, not physical but emotional, institutional, the violence of being dismissed, ridiculed, or erased. She talked about the workers who had come to her since, not to thank her, but to tell her what they'd been holding back, waiting to say, now finally unafraid. And most of all, she talked about what comes next, not for her, but for the country. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about every person watching who thinks they have to wait their turn to speak. You don't. You never did. You just needed to see someone survive the fallout to believe you could." Clips of the interview exploded online. Millions viewed it within hours. But it wasn't the platform that made it powerful. It was the truth inside it. It was a lawyer, not trying to be famous, but trying to hold the door open just a little wider for the people who would walk through it after her. People who would speak, maybe not with the same words, but with the same fire. And long after the cameras cut and the anchor thanked her for her time, Jasmine stayed in that chair for a moment longer, staring into the quiet studio lights. Not to enjoy the silence, but to remember what it had cost to fill it. Because she knew, perhaps better than anyone in the country at that moment, that silence is never neutral. It's a choice, and hers was never to be quiet again. And as Jasmine Crockett's voice echoed from courtrooms to television screens, from factory floors to Capitol Hill, what remained after the dust settled was not just a legal victory or a public reckoning. It was a lesson, a hard, human, undeniable lesson. One that couldn't be confined to a press release or captured fully in headlines. Because this was never just about a woman being removed from a courtroom. It was about everything that removal represented. It was about the rules we use to define acceptable voices, the quiet mechanisms that silence truth when it becomes too sharp, too uncomfortable, too unmanageable for the systems built to contain it. The moral wasn't wrapped in triumph. It was forged in confrontation. Jasmine had walked into a place that was supposed to represent fairness and found that fairness had terms and conditions. She hadn't violated the law. She hadn't disrupted proceedings with chaos. Her only offense was refusing to soften her truth to fit the mold of decorum. That truth, that justice cannot thrive in a space where voices are policed more strictly than power, is what shattered the illusion of balance in that courtroom. Her ejection became a mirror, forcing the nation to look at itself and ask, who gets to speak freely? Who is told they're too much, too loud, too emotional? The answer, painful as it was, became the seed of change. Jasmine's experience reminded us that justice, when too tightly managed, stops being just. That order, when weaponized, becomes a mask for control. And that dignity, true dignity, requires space for dissent, for disruption, for voices that don't always speak in measured tones. She showed us that sometimes the path to a better system begins when someone refuses to play by the rules written to keep them small. Sometimes the most courageous act is not staying silent in the name of politeness, but speaking louder precisely because the silence is what's killing the truth. Her story teaches that bravery is not about dramatic gestures. It's about persistence in the face of dismissal. It's about continuing to speak even after you've been told to sit down. It's about returning to the room that rejected you, not for revenge, but because you believe that the room itself must change. That lesson, carved through Jasmine's every word, every step, every breath she took after being silenced, is the heartbeat of her legacy. She did not ask to become a symbol. She did not seek the spotlight. She sought justice. And when justice slammed the door in her face, she stood outside and made the entire nation listen. In the end, Jasmine Crockett taught us this. True justice is not fragile. It does not fear passion. It does not break under pressure. What breaks is the illusion that order alone can protect fairness. What crumbles is the belief that power will always self-correct. Her journey was a reminder that sometimes the only way to fix a broken system is to stand in its most sacred room, call it what it is, and refuse to leave quietly when it tries to bury you. That's not just a legal lesson. That's a human one, and it will echo long after her footsteps fade from that courtroom floor. Considering word count and style, the user wants a call to action in 1,400 words, but they've asked for 9 to 10 sentences in a paragraph. That's tricky, since 1,400 words divided by 9 to 10 sentences means each sentence would need to be about 150 to 160 words. I'm going to keep the dramatic tension and call to action intact while stretching the sentences to fit the word count. I'll aim for clarity while keeping the excitement in the writing. Should be interesting. Let's try crafting these long sentences. Thought for 10 seconds, and if Jasmine Crockett's fight cracks something open inside you, if that single defiant moment when she was pushed out of the courtroom left your heart thundering with the knowledge that justice is never gifted but seized, then let that pulse turn into purpose, because a spark of outrage left unused is just a story you'll tell instead of a world you'll change. And every system that once silenced someone like Jasmine is counting on your attention, drifting back to comfort before you turn indignation into action that costs you time, breath, and the willingness to make powerful people uncomfortable. Look hard at the rooms you occupy. Warehouse aisles lit by dim fluorescence. Conference calls where someone's idea is steamrolled by polished voices. Classrooms where a student's accent becomes the joke that no teacher corrects. And notice how often truth is told to wait its turn while profit, prejudice, or protocol moves to the front of the line. Understand that injustice isn't always a baton or a billy club. Sometimes it's a meeting agenda that never reaches the last item because the chair respects the schedule, or a dress code that polices hair more strictly than harassment, or a performance evaluation that weighs obedience heavier than courage. And know that each quiet cut leaves wounds that never show on the body, but bleed morale, dignity, and hope until entire communities accept pain as normal. So speak even if your voice cracks, because a cracked voice still shatters silence. Write the email demanding hazard pay and copy every supervisor on the thread. Organize your coworkers into a lunchtime caucus that translates frustration into strategy. Refuse to let racist or misogynistic jokes pass as camaraderie. Share the clip of Jasmine's removal with friends who think decorum is sacred and ask whether decorum ever protected the powerless when power felt threatened. Because if the status quo cannot survive honest conversation, perhaps it deserves to collapse under the weight of truth. Show up at the town hall mic with your shaking hands and say the grievance that's been whispered in the break room for years. Stand in front of city council members who mistake low turnout for approval and remind them that every empty seat represents someone too exhausted, too scared, or too cynical to believe change is possible. And swear that you are there for those invisible constituents until attendance becomes a movement instead of a formality. Carry cardboard signs, printed fact sheets, and bottled water to the picket line even if you've never walked one. Crowdsource donations for legal fees instead of birthday presents. Refuse to let your social media feed return to brunch photos until the workers in those kitchens earn enough to eat brunch themselves. Vote, not as a timid checkbox exercise, but as a declaration that you will track every politician's promises, like invoices, following up with emails, phone calls, and public comments until their accountability outweighs corporate contributions. Pressure committee chairs with petitions that reach the threshold where ignoring you becomes a headline. Flood public hearing rooms so densely that lobbyists must squeeze past the communities they once dismissed. And when election season fades, keep meeting, keep counting, keep pushing until the fear of broken campaign pledges haunts every official more than the fear of lost donors. Link arms with unions old and new, because collective bargaining remains the most effective firewall against exploitation. If you have a union, strengthen it with attendance and bylaws that center the most vulnerable. If you lack a union, study Jasmine's refusal, gather colleagues over midnight coffee, and file those authorization cards despite management's open-door platitudes, understanding that employers prefer doors open so long as workers step through one at a time instead of marching together. Celebrate each negotiated safety clause as a life potentially saved, each wage increase as hours of childhood returned to parents pushed into overtime, and each grievance procedure as a guarantee that retaliation loses both its sting and its stealth. Spend privilege like currency that spoils unused. If you have a platform, lend it. If you have spare hours, volunteer them. If you possess specialized skills, legal drafting, spreadsheet wizardry, translation, embed them into campaigns that cannot afford consultants. Remember, revolutions are built on childcare rotas, potluck tables, debugging sessions for donation pages, and midnight carpools to legislative hearings. Mundane tasks that accumulate into unstoppable momentum when performed with the stubborn joy of people who refuse to accept that someone else will handle it. Never forget that the law, no matter how ornate its language, is only ink until living people read it aloud, argue its failures in public, and rewrite the parts that have calcified into shields for the powerful. Precedents may seem eternal, but they are merely agreements forged by generations brave enough to test the courts. So treat each small win as a down payment on the next fight. Log every setback as data for better strategy. Teach children that the First Amendment is not a permission slip, but a muscle that must be exercised loudly or it will atrophy in the quiet. And should you ever stand in a room where truth is labeled disorder and passion mistaken for threat, whether that room is a marble courtroom or a fluorescent break room, remember Jasmine's warning that sometimes you must be pushed out so everyone else finally sees the door. Plant your feet, lift your voice, and refuse to be the kind of silence that lets injustice rest easy. Because history is written by those who stayed loud when the world demanded quiet. And now it's your turn to be impossible to ignore. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.